Welcome to Elixir Wizards, a podcast where we talk with software developers from around the world about the Elixir language and other modern web technologies. My name is Justice Eapen, and I'm your host today. I'm a developer at Smart Logic, a Baltimore-based consulting company that has been building custom web and mobile software applications since 2005. From the Smart Logic team today, I'm joined by my wonderful co-host, Eric Ostrich.
Hello.
And we have a very special guest host today, our good friend from the Elixir world, Todd Rezadek.
Hi, gentlemen.
Todd, so glad to have you back on the show. You're a recurring guest, and today you are helping us host this very special episode. The theme of this season of Elixir Wizards is working with Elixir. So we've been talking to guests about performance, functional programming, hiring and training in Elixir, lots of different topics just all around working with Elixir in real life. And today we've got a very special guest, very well known in the Elixir community, Eric Meadows Jönsson from Brex. How are you, Eric?
I'm good. Thanks for having me.
Eric, we're really glad to have you on. You're really well known in the community, someone who's really contributed a lot to different open source projects. And, if you could just maybe introduce yourself, tell us a little bit about your background, the company that you work at, and how you got started with Elixir.
Yeah, sure. So I work at Brex. My background has really been a lot of functional programming. I got started with Elixir fairly early in its development, I think either late 2012 or early 2013. And I really got started working with the language through the library Ecto, which you probably heard of. So during the summer 2013, during a project similar to Google Summer of Code, I started working on Ecto with Jönsson as my mentor for that. And that's really how I got involved with the language and with the core of Elixir.
So when you got started on this, working on Ecto, and Jose was sort of mentoring you along the way, how long had you been programming for?
Oh, that's a good question. I've been programming for definitely a few years before that. I hadn't done a lot of functional programming before that. I got started with functional programming a few years before Elixir, I think. But I only had a hobby experience from programming. And I was at the university at that time, so really not that much.
That's interesting. I didn't realize that Ecto came out of a Google Summer of Code project.
Yes, it wasn't exactly Google Summer of Code. So the plan was for it to be Google Summer of Code. Unfortunately, if I remember the story correctly, the project, like the Beam Community Project, I think it's called, only got one slot that year. And that slot got to someone else, but were a few other companies that wanted a database library like that. So they sponsored basically the equivalent of Google Summer of Code. And basically we roughly went through the same process.
I guess if we zoom forward a bit in the timeline of you. So I think recently I heard, so you just started working at Brex pretty recently, and I think you were hired to work on a type system for Elixir. How's that going?
So not necessarily a type system. What I'm doing is I'm working on adding basically static compile time checks to the compiler, which is not necessarily a type system. What we might end up with might be similar to a type system or actually a type system, but we might end up with something completely different. So as an example, we have a few compile time checks in the language right now. For example, you get warnings if you call functions that are not defined, when you use the struct syntax, when you create structs, update structs, and so on. We check that the fields that you're updating actually exist on the struct. So basically what we want to do is add more checks like that. It might end up with that the best way of adding checks like that might be something similar to a type system. We don't know yet. Right now, we're mostly laying the foundations. We are doing a lot of research on the best way of doing this. It's pretty much in the early stages right now, but it's going well. 1.10, the release coming up now, will have some of the foundations for that, not a lot of more checks added. We refactored some of the deprecation checks that we have, those warnings, the undefined checks. We moved those out from mix and into the compiler so we can do those checks in more places. For example, if you call undefined functions in your test code, you will get warnings in 1.10 that you didn't get in 1.9. But that's really the only thing that we have put into the stable version so far. But I think you will see more in the next versions.
So this sounds like this is happening at compile time, or at least when the Elixir code is compiling into the bytecode.
Yes.
Is there any objectives to move this into the Beam compiler directly, or parts of it?
So we've been thinking about stuff like that. So for example, the Erlang compiler already does some type inference during compilation. I think only for optimization, and I'm not sure, but maybe Dialyzer and Hype also uses that type information. So we've been looking at if we can use the same inference to get more type information and to do more counts of checks, but we haven't used that yet, and we're not sure if we can use it. So right now, the shakes that we do happen in Elixir and in Elixir only, and we don't really pass that information down to the underlying compilation passes. And I would say it's probably too early right now to really look at those kinds of things, but we didn't start in that end. So no, right now there are no plans basically because we haven't gotten that far yet.
All right. Well, it sounds like it's going pretty well so far. You've been working on it for, I think, since February or so?
Yeah, earlier this year, springtime this year, I think, yeah.
So how's your Erlang? I know Jose mentioned at the keynote this year that he was his future looked like it was going to be working deeper into the Beam stack, and which I assume means more Erlang. And I guess the project we work on most often together is Hex, and the person I see making the most confident Erlang contributions there is Wojtek, or at least is among the maintainers. How is your Erlang, I guess, and are you planning on getting better at that?
I've been decent at Erlang for a while at least. I actually knew Erlang before I knew Elixir, but then kind of forgot a lot. I had to pick up some more, kind of get more into it as I've been working on moving stuff around in the Elixir compiler. Some of the deep internals are in Erlang.
Which this is a great segue because you mentioned Hex. And I think actually part of the way that we got you on the show here, Eric, was I guess over the summer, I was working on a Hex package for one of our clients, and I discovered that the CLI timeout configuration feature seemed to be performing a no-op. And I sort of just complained about it in the Elixir Lang Slack. And you reached out and fixed it in like 20 minutes. Like, what happened there? What was wrong with Hex? How did you get started with Hex? Tell us the story with Hex. And also, just why are you so helpful?
So I usually try to hang around the Slack and IRC channels because that's the best way of knowing if there are issues with the libraries or the services that we run. So I usually try to hang around there and try to answer questions that I can answer, or if there's bugs in my libraries, I, of course, try to fix them. So in this particular case, this was a few months ago, I think. It was a really silly bug. We do a bit of parsing or checking of the input values as we start up Hex, and the Hex timeout or the HTTP timeout configuration is one of those. And we were basically just parsing that incorrectly so that even when the timeout configuration was passed, we didn't actually use it. So that was easy and quick fix, fortunately.
Fortunately for me.
Yeah, fortunately for us all, I think. And how I get started with Hex. So Hex started out as a registry for Elixir GitHub packages, if I remember correctly. And this was a bit after I worked on Ecto. I don't think I was on the Elixir team at this point, but as I started working on Hex, I got a lot of help from Jose, of course, since we worked together in one way or another on most of these projects. I think, Hex started before Elixir 1.0, and just very humbly, the problem that we had was that everyone depended on everyone used, like when you declare a mixed dependency, they used like Git or the GitHub. And the problem we had was that everyone depended on the master branch. At that time as well, there was a lot of changes in the language. So some breaking changes and a lot of warnings and stuff like that. And when Elixir was updated and you tried to update your project to the new version, there was a lot of hassle trying to make sure that your dependencies were working with the new version. Yeah, so the first version of Hex was just adding an index for the Git packages, basically, or for the Git repositories. And from that, it grew into something way more ambitious than it should have. Maybe it worked into its own package tarballs and its own registry and stuff like that from that.
So how did Hex get its name, by the way? It doesn't have an obvious tie to Elixir or anything Elixir-y.
Yeah, so the name is, well, it's sort of Elixir, right? It's Hex, right? Which is into like the whole magic thing that Elixir, for better or worse, has a group of names. Yeah, exactly. And I think Hex is sort of in that vein. And the person that named it is called Devin, who's the author of the Pool Boy project. And I think he also named the Ecto project as well. So he came up with a lot of good names.
And Todd, you've got some experience on Hex. I'm curious if from your experience working on Hex, you have any sort of insight into sort of Eric's habits and productivity.
A little bit. So first of all, Eric is a great mentor, or has been a great mentor for me, and I think I speak for Wojtek as well, as we're trying to contribute to Hex and all of the libraries that go along with it. I appreciate the fact that Eric seems not to sleep very much because he's available during U.S. working hours as well as like U.S. after hours. And so I'm not sure exactly when we overlap on sleep, but apparently he's not a very sleep conscious person on that as well. And but yeah, just been very positive, very helpful, very easygoing maintainer. So I would say, like a lot of people in the Elixir community, the anti-Linus. So very smart, but also very, very nice people.
And since you're both here, I mean, does Hex as a project have a direction for the future that you could maybe share with us, and also, requirements as far as help?
Hex is in a pretty good place right now. For me, I was really excited about a year or two ago, we launched the private packages, which I was very happy for because I didn't have to pay for Hex myself anymore, which is a nice. And right now, yeah, like I said, it's in a good place. We have some plans for the future. We want to release Hex 1.0, which is not that of a big deal. It's just means that it's really no changes for the user. It just means that Hex is stable now. And with that, we want to do a few changes. So for example, one of the changes is make it easier for the maintainers, which is dropping support for the earlier Elixir versions. Hex 1.0 will have support for Elixir 1.0 like we do today. But the next Hex version, we start dropping support from earlier Elixir versions. And that's really to make it easier for us to maintain Hex. There's a lot of nice things in Elixir that we can't use right now. For example, we can't use with, which is a very common tool that we use today, but that we can't use in Hex. So we want to have a Hex version that will still be maintained and mostly get security updates, but we will have a Hex version that we can add more features to, and we can use the more powerful features on as well. And apart from that, there's really no big changes that we have planned that users will notice. There's a few minor things, really. Well, big features implementation-wise, but small features for the user. For example, we want to refactor the version resolution algorithm, which we can I think we're going to talk about performance a bit more later, which we can talk about more then as well, because it has some performance problems that we want to solve.
Yeah, I think I talked about this a little bit last time I was on. I've been mainly trying to focus on security related stuff, and I've been discussing with other package manager maintainers, Curtis from Ruby Gems, Sean from Crates, try to figure out what the kind of common problems we're all running into and try to come up with, or at least take advantage of the time that they've spent trying to find solutions on that. And we have a couple of other cool things coming out. Johanna is actively working on, and Eric and Wojtek have been spending a lot of time with her on sort of polishing the edges of the visual diff. And so that's going to be a pretty cool feature, I think, that people will really notice and hopefully get a lot of use out of.
I guess while we're on this question, I'm curious if like the hex.pm website especially like once you get into paying for private repositories? Is there a roadmap there, or is that a separate organization that's sort of working on that?
No, so it's very much related to each other. So the things we use to run private packages are available for all users. So we have a repository called hexpm/specifications, and there's nothing private packages uses that are not specified. So we have projects like Wojtek is building right now called Mini Repo, which is a way of running your own private repository without using the HexPM paid features, which you can use, for example, if you want to self-host a repository. And they use exactly the same APIs and the same specifications that a private packages uses. So those are very much related. And the roadmap for HexPM is basically, well, it's the API and the website for the main repository of Elixir and Erlang packages. And that's it, basically. And I want to continue a little bit on what Tom was talking about security. So security and insight into packages is something that we're always working on. So the diffing between package versions is a new feature that Johanna has been developing for us, that we hope to be releasing hopefully in the next few weeks. We have always had audit logs for everything that happens to a package and to happen to a user. So for example, when someone publishes a new package, if they retire a version, something like that, we do an audit log for that. So we're always able to go back and look at what has exactly happened to a package. We made that visible and things like that. So that's something that is ongoing all the time. Not really, some of the things become part of the roadmap, but it's really ongoing and something that we look at.
Todd, I think you had some questions about hiring and training. Maybe you want to jump into?
Yeah, we don't have to talk about Hex all day. So Eric, I know you've been busy working on a few different projects the last couple of years, but you spent a bunch of time at a company called Forza Football or Football Addicts, which I think is based there in Gothenburg. Now you had a pretty great team, at least there for a while. So you were there. Andrea from the core team was also there. Alexei, I think is or was there as well.
Is on the core team, yeah.
Yeah, as well as some other people that that I might be forgetting. So how did you get all those people? Who was first and who the responsible for hiring, like that great team that you had? And maybe when you brought them all in or when they came in, were they necessarily like the strongest Elixir or Erlang programmers, or was that a result of the training that you guys did at Forza?
Yeah. So unfortunately, I can't say that I was responsible for hiring most of those people. So I joined after Alexei and Andrea. I was on the core team when I was hired. I don't think Andrea was on the core team, and I'm not sure about Alexei either. But Andrea wasn't on the core team, if I remember correctly. So he joined the core team when he was working at Forza, which is a really good thing, right? So he and Alexei worked a lot together on open source projects, on Elixir itself. So I think that was a really good opportunity to, I'm not sure what to call it, but I guess kind of join that position. So at the time we had 3 Elixir core members working at Forza, which was really cool. And I think something Forza did really well was that Forza is based in Gothenburg, Sweden. And at the time, I'm pretty sure they were one of the few companies in Sweden using Elixir, and probably the only company in Gothenburg using it. So it wasn't easy to hire people that knew Elixir. But one thing that Forza did well was that they looked outside of Sweden. So a lot of the hires at Forza are from the rest of Europe, Eastern Europe, for example, where you find people that ideally know the language, but also are very passionate for functional programming and so on. And by looking at all of Europe, or not necessarily just Europe, Asia and the US as well. The US is a bit hard to hire people from the US because salaries are generally higher for developers than in Europe, or at least smaller cities in Europe like Gothenburg. But by looking at Europe and looking at people from Europe and from Asia, you have a much larger pool to hire from. And it's much easier to find people, not just someone that is a developer, but actually someone that likes being a developer and is passionate and actually want to learn. Because I think for most companies, or at least for many companies, it's hard to find Elixir developers. And instead, you want to hire someone that wants to learn Elixir. And you're looking for someone that is easy to train for Elixir.
And when you're training someone who's new to Elixir, have you found any tactics that are especially helpful in the training process, or aspects of the Elixir language that are the biggest hurdles for people to jump?
So it depends on what they know before they start in Elixir, but sometimes we have hired people that don't know functional programming at all. And especially, so I do trainings usually at the Elixir conferences, and those trainings are for people new to the language. And we need to target those for people that are also new to functional programming. So really what you want to do is start with the fundamentals, and really more than teach Elixir, you want to teach functional programming, where the important things are you use data structure to model your data. And after that, you build your functions around that data, and you go from there. And then there's a bunch of other things which are easier to teach, like pattern matching, recursion, and stuff like that. But really, I think the fundamentals is knowing that functional programming is about the data. And if you have an object-oriented background, it's easy to start trying to think about class design and stuff like that, which is something I struggle with. And actually, when you start from the data structures and you build the implementation around that, it's much easier to think about your problems that way.
Can we just talk about, the candidate coming in and they say, here's who you're going to be technically interviewing with today, and it's 3 members of the Elixir core team, and how that goes? It's either you're either going to be, okay, I'm out of here and pull the Grandpa Simpson, or you say, well, this must be the fast track to the core team, and let me not screw this up.
Yeah. So fortunately, I don't think we ever had all of us 3 interview a candidate at the same time, which was probably a good thing.
No, I think that's a good thing. I think it'd be very intimidating if someone ever requested, I need to interview with all 3 of these guys. Kudos to them.
Yeah. So the best things were probably when people didn't know who we were.
They start talking about other ORM designs, and they're like,
yeah, exactly.
One thing I would change
about shit talking some library that someone was made. But kidding aside, I think so. Talking about the technical interviews, I think we tried to keep it pretty relaxed. And before we got into any technical interviews, the candidate had made some kind of project or some kind of code problem that they had sent in. And that's always nice to have, because then you have something to talk about. Yeah, and then we just try to go from there.
So aside from training these people up, I'm curious, on your own journey, you mentioned when you came to the Elixir world was your first time being exposed to functional programming. Can you talk a little bit about your personal journey in terms of learning functional programming? What were the major hurdles for you to leap intellectually, and what helped you to understand the major concepts?
Yeah, sure. So before Elixir, I had done some functional programming, mostly only for a few years. So I had been doing object-oriented programming in various languages before that for a few years. But it was in university I was exposed to functional programming. So the university I went to in Gothenburg, called Chalmers, is very good in this regard, that use a lot of functional programming. And the first course that we had was in functional programming, and it was in Haskell. And that was a bit of a shock for me, because when I went into university at that time, I basically thought that, I know programming by now. So university is going to be easy, and I'm going to have a nice time. And I had a nice time because I was exposed to functional programming. But there was at that point, I didn't really know that different programming paradigms, and being exposed to functional programming was obviously a very good thing for me. And really the hard part was especially with Haskell, was really working with the types, because when I started out with Haskell, I felt like the types were a roadblock for me. But really, as I started using it more, I learned that when I had a typing problem, like when my code was correct, but I had a typing problem, it really meant that I didn't really know what my code did. It just worked. And when I saw the types, when I had the type checker working, I really understood the program in a more deeper level.
So when during that time of your sort of development as a programmer, I'm curious, like what helped you to understand types? Because I think that's definitely something that a lot of people get stuck on. Did you have any aha moments or anything in particular that was like, oh, that's how it works and why it works?
Oh, that's a good question. Unfortunately, I don't think there really was an aha moment. It was
like a slow grind.
Yeah, it was like all of programming when you learn it, like you churn through it, you do different problems, and eventually, well, it's basically doing more programming, right? As you do more programming, you get it more. It would be really nice if there was like a cheat code, but if there is, I don't really know it.
Well, I think we've talked a little bit about functional programming here, and we can always dive back into it. But we do have several questions here on performance, and I think that we had mentioned earlier in the conversation sort of performance bottlenecks in Hex and how you've dealt with those. Do you have any stories or anecdotes or tips or tricks that you learned working on Hex?
Yeah, sure. So to talk about Hex specifically, so the main thing with Hex that we try to optimize is when you run mix steps get, right? It's when we take the dependencies from your mix file. We take, if you have lock dependencies in your lock file, we take that set of dependencies and we try to find the dependencies that you want to use. And that's what we call dependency resolution. And we can get back to that in a bit. So the second thing we do after we resolve your dependencies to actually fetch them, right? And that's also an important piece of the performance. It actually usually takes longer than the dependency resolution, because we have to do network. Well, basically, we have to fetch things over the network. And Elixir is very nice in this regard because it's easy to parallelize those things. And there's other things that we do outside of Elixir that I think is important for developers working on services to think about. And I think the most important performance optimizations that we have done in Hex was actually move from fetching things directly from Amazon S3 and to put a content delivery network in front of it. So right now we use Fastly for that, and they are sponsoring us for that. So we're very thankful for Fastly for sponsoring us there and paying for our costs. But that was by far the best performance optimizations that we have done in Hex. And it went from, doing mix steps get with 50 packages took like more than 5 seconds. And now it's 1 second. That's really the major thing when you run mix steps get. It's fetching the packages, and optimizing the network was actually more important than optimizing the code. And to talk about the dependency resolution, which is an ongoing problem that we have in Hex, that sometimes dependency resolution is very slow. And that's because, so basically what we do is that we take your dependencies from your mix file, and then we need to resolve the versions for those dependencies so that we can actually fetch the specific versions that you need. And by doing that, we need to go down to your dependencies and find matching version requirements, versions matching the version requirements for those dependencies. And we need to go into sub-dependencies and so on. And doing this is my computer science is failing me right now. It's NP hard or NP complete or something like that, but it's non-polynomial, and basically it's very slow to do it. During the dependency resolution, we do a bunch of shortcuts so that we quicker can find the set of versions that you want. And usually that is the latest version of every package that matches your requirements. Unfortunately, sometimes those shortcuts fail, and especially when there is no successful outcome from the dependency resolution, all those shortcuts kind of fail, and we need to test everything basically. And that are times when it can be very slow, and so slow that it actually never completes, which is obviously a bad user experience. So that's something that we haven't found a solution for yet, unfortunately. We have some ideas of how to improve it. So basically, right now, basically the algorithm right now was built during an afternoon, like 5 years ago, and has been patched since then to be more performant for specific use cases. So it's not that nice today. So basically what we want to do is we want to rewrite it from scratch. And there are some documented version resolution algorithms. There's one called pubgrub or something like that the Dart package manager uses, which is kind of a specification on how version resolution should work, which we're going to try out. So yeah, so I don't have a good answer for that yet, but hopefully sometime in the future we will have a good solution.
I think my background in this is that there are always compromises. Every package manager, every resolver has some compromise or some place where it falls down. So NPM would be an example I'd point to that would probably always resolve. There's no reason it shouldn't resolve because NPM is comfortable bringing in multiple subdependencies that would be different versions. So those will never have conflicts. Rebar 3 is similar, but also different. It uses like something closer to Maven style resolution, which is more optimistic, which is to say that these two subdependencies are not compatible. And so where Hex would never resolve, Rebar is more optimistic to say, we'll assume this newer version will work for both. And so we'll just stick with that. And it may lead to weird behaviors in your system. And that's the compromise that they make there. And so there's no one right answer for everything. So I would say it is very complicated. And if you happen to get the wrong combination of dependencies that have subdependencies that are defined or subdependencies that maybe don't use semver correctly, you could have yourself a very bad day. But I'm not sure that will ever be 100% fixed in any package manager.
So one thing I'm curious about, so you're also a co-author of Mint. So was Mint spawned out of a desire to make the network performance like better for Hex? Like, is that kind of how it started up?
Yeah, for sure. So Mint came from 3 different things, I would say, made us start building Mint. So for me personally, one thing was that I wanted an HTTP client that I could use in Hex that supported HTTP2. And one of the constraints we have when we build the Hex client, so the command line interface that you install when you run mixlocal.hex. So one of the constraints there is that we cannot use dependencies because Hex runs in the context of the Mix project. And inside the Mix project, you have your own applications dependencies loaded. So if Hex had dependencies, those would conflict with the dependencies in your own project. So I needed a Hex client that I could vendor in Hex. So basically that means copy the source code into Hex, rewrite the module names, and it just works. Unfortunately, that doesn't work for most HTTP clients in the ecosystem right now because they have other complicated things than the module names. For example, you need to start an application. There are name processes and so on. There are ETS tables that are named that would conflict. And so one of the design goals of Mint was to not have a defined process or architecture. So Mint, the library Mint doesn't start any processes. It doesn't start any ETS table. It doesn't need a supervision tree or anything like that. So it's the user of Mint that decides on what kind of pooling you want, what kind of processes that you want to spawn. The third reason was that at the time, we didn't know if the built-in HTTP client in OTP was going to be continued or be kept supported, the client called HTTPC. So that was another reason we wanted to kind of explore Mint and see if maybe, because if that was the case, we needed Mix itself need an HTTP client. So if there isn't an HTTP client in OTP, then Elixir needs one. And then it turned out that OTP it looks like they're going to be continuing to support HTTPC. So Mint will not be added to Elixir instead. But it turned out well in the end because it's really good as a standalone library as well.
Eric, I want to give you time to plug any of your projects or companies or anything that you're working on. But before I do, I want to ask Todd, do you have any final questions that you want to slide in here?
No, I'm good.
Okay. We like to give folks at the end of the episode time for plugs, asks for the audience. If you want to tell people where to find you online, your social media, how to get involved and support your projects. This is your time to shamelessly self-promote in any way, shape, or form.
Yeah, so you can find me, as I said earlier in the episode, you can find me on Slack and IRC. I'm also on Twitter, EMJII. And I would love for you to try out Mint, try it out in your project, see how it works compared to other HP clients. And we're always appreciative of any help on the Hex project, all of those repositories. So github.com/HexPM, you can find the Hex client, the HexPM website, all those related things. So please go check that out. And if you think you can help with anything, that's always very appreciated.
Thank you so much, Eric. Eric Meadows Jönsson, everybody, joined us all the way from Sweden, several hours ahead in the day. It's like 10:30, 11 o'clock at night for you over there?
Yeah, it's late.
Eric Meadows Jönsson, tirelessly working for the Elixir community. Thank you so much for joining us. Todd Rezadek, thank you for co-hosting this episode of Elixir Wizards.
Thank you for having me, Justice.
You are a joy to have on the show. And of course, my beloved co-host, Eric Ostrich. And I am Justice Epen. This has been an episode of Elixir Wizards with your friends here at Smart Logic. Don't forget to hit subscribe and join us next time for more conversation on working with Elixir.